Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this month's growth series, which is a series of webinars covering a range of different topics this week. So we've done a series in April, and now we're doing a series in May covering a range of different topics. We're thrilled today to have Konstantin Kamaris with us. Very privileged, actually, that he's made the time available to spend some time with us, talking a little bit about the publisher ecosystem and his experience learning what's working, what's not working, and how can publishers not only survive in today's challenging world, but actually thrive, given all the pressures that we've seen from obviously the big social channels, the big other platforms, and of course more recently around the threat or opportunity of AI. So I'm not going to spend much time talking. I really want to get as much value out of Konstantin's experience and expertise in this area as we can. Feel free to add questions into the chat and we can answer those towards the end, or we'll have a little Q&A at the end. There will be time for that, I'm sure. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Konstantin. Thanks very much for your time, Konstantin.
Well, thank you, Ian, Sibel, the team, and the board for having me, for inviting me. This is a topic I'm very passionate about, even though with my IEB Europe hat, I work with stakeholders from across the ecosystem. The truth is that I have a soft spot for publishers because this is where I originated, this is where I started. To give you a hint of my age, that was newspapers where I started. But it still remains, in my view, publishers remain a critical cornerstone of the media ecosystem for a variety of reasons. So, without further ado, I'm giving the game away now because we're going to be discussing a possibly new strategic framework emerging for publishers. So if you see, as you see from the title, again, the bedrocks, quality and transparency equals trust. I will be coming to that to get to growth. And times two, why? Because this applies both for the reader market and the advertising market. Now, the picture, broadly speaking, not only for publishers, is rather grim. It is not for me, I think, to talk about geopolitics. The market in the Middle East very well understands what this means, but this is certainly a point of turbulence. Macroeconomics, same thing, high level of uncertainty and concerning signals. Financial markets, again, despite the exuberance, there are trouble points there to be monitored, like private lending and what have you. Generative AI and what this means for the business model. And among all those things, it might seem odd to speak about publisher growth, but possibly we can get there. And it might seem a bit odd because on the surface, things do not look too bright. For instance, we have, due to generative AI, principally traffic declines. What used to be, a traffic hose from the search engines, now with the AI overviews and AI mode, these are becoming much narrower, and indeed the audience development funnel narrows. We had a problem before with platform dominance. If you add to that AI, if you add also the growing popularity of creators and whatever's next, because there is bound to be something coming next, paints a picture that's not incredibly bright. Lest, we forget, if one looks at the behavior of Gen Z, or even more actually, Gen Alpha, heavy social media use, but also bear in mind the interface of, say, ChatGPT, the question bar, becoming for this generation what the Google search bar was for previous generations. So in that sense, there is a major challenge. Also, in terms of subscriptions, we're seeing a plateau. After the election of Trump in 2016, and then with the pandemic, we saw major bumps in subscriptions, but that is increasingly plateauing despite the bad news around us. And here, if one is to strategize, one would have to recall that there is a 10% rule of thumb, which means only 10% of audiences would ever be willing, according to surveys from the Reuters Institute, let's say, to pay for news. Now, this is not a uniform number. In the south of Europe, this can be in the high single digits. In Scandinavia, it can be close to 20. So the average for business planning purposes to begin with would be the 10% rule of thumb. Then there's also what I call the 99-1 pyramid. 90% of your audience is anonymous browsers, 9% would be registered users, and 1% would be paid subscribers. Again, rule of thumbs, but it's important to have an understanding of the whole audience and where they belong if one is to develop strategies for the near future. Now, this means that for many premium publishers, the pivot has gone from acquisition to retention and to a metric that is usually found more in retail rather than publishing historically, the ARPU, the annual revenue per user metric. This is becoming incredibly crucial because we're moving from acquisition more to retention and the minimization of churn, which is actually something that taxes resources and revenues significantly. Is there hope in advertising? Sometimes things can look quite pessimistic with the platform dominance that we know all across the world, but also with the new juggernaut of retail media across several markets is the fastest growing segment. The chronic pain point of brand safety, where publishers with, if you like, very superficial keyword blocking approaches are found not to be brand safe. I'll be returning to that point. But also the fact that when it comes to scale, to data and tools, one would not be exaggerating if one said that platforms are clearly ahead. And when it comes to new revenue sources, again, hopeful signals, but yet not something game-changing, either in commerce, events, or research on insights. Though there is potential in all those. The most critical thing, and I cannot stress this enough here, because when senior publishing executives sit around the room, they throw ideas, some of them can be very interesting, is what we call the impact to effort ratio. And it's a point I insist on for several reasons. The most important is that publishers, like everyone, but publishers specifically, have finite resources, which means you need to be able to accurately measure potential impact and accurately measure potential effort with trial and error, with hits and misses, but I cannot overstate the importance of fine-tuning how one operates in the impact to effort ratio. This helps both assess which project one goes ahead with, but also within those that make the grade, to prioritize among them, which one goes first, second, or third. This is a framework that is increasingly being used by large publishers in Europe, and this is something I wholeheartedly advise publishers to get working on. However, the optimistic part here is trying essentially to redefine what growth means. There was, for instance, a recent survey by WNIFRA, the World Association of Newspapers and News Publishers, that said that 2 out of 3 senior publishing executives are optimistic about the future, optimistic. And I found that, quite surprising. And digging deeper, one sees that publishers are starting, belatedly, one might argue, to redefine what is success and what isn't. Historically, we at publishing always had an obsession with quantity and size, to have a big circulation, a big TV audience. Everything had to be big and very much quantity based. Well, in the ocean that is today the digital communications ecosystem, being the biggest sounds surreal with global platforms present everywhere. So increasingly, what we're seeing is people readjusting in terms of size and accepting that it's better to be a strong, healthy, profitable, mid-sized, or even comparatively speaking, small entity rather than breathlessly seeking size. And there is an entire quantity versus quality reset that is taking place. And this is fundamental for the key changes that need to take place for publishers in order for them to not only survive, but as Ian said earlier, to thrive. The quality versus quantity reset is something, it's a slow moving process, admittedly, but it's something that is absolutely critical. I was struck a few weeks ago. I was in a closed publisher meeting in Europe, and I saw the numbers from a brand owned by Le Monde called Nouvel Observateur that actually cut down the number of articles it was producing every day by half and invested all its resources into delivering much better output for the other half that stayed. Traffic increased, all the KPIs increased. So fewer but better tends to be a mantra to follow. And the same thing goes in relationships, possibly with advertisers as well and readers. I was tempted to use two Greek words, polyamorous and monogamous. Of course, these are rhetorical hyperboles, exaggerations. But the principle of not being afraid of having fewer but deeper, more long-term relationships is quite clear. And now, what I would like to do is examine the 5 key pillars, one slide each, of the premium publishing business model and see where we stand today and what we could be doing as publishers. So, as I was saying earlier, revenue growth comes much less from acquisition and more from retention management and the rise in annual revenue per user. Nurturing and retaining your customer base, it's an old axiom of marketing. The easiest client to get is the one you already have. This has very important consequences on how we plan our business operations. But here, what has become critical is not only offering design, but pricing. For instance, it has been found that small, sequential, frequent, but small price increases appear to be much more favorable than raising the price notably every 2 years. So this has been adopted and has minimized the loss of subscribers due to pricing increase. The other thing that has increasingly started taking place is the abolition of free trials. Now trials include even €1 as a test phase. Why? Because you need to go through the gesture of taking €1 out of your pocket, of your wallet, and actually paying. Even if it is €1, it makes a difference in terms of concept and in terms of mental approach. The other thing, again, along the same context, is the increasing emphasis that publishers are putting on the win-back phase in the subscription operation, which means after a subscriber has declared that they want to cancel. There's a last-minute effort. Historically, this was only based on price. So people, a phone operator or an email would come out and say, okay, we'll give you 40% off. It was ham-fisted. It was not subtle at all. It was unjust to other subscribers, and people that got wind of it would do this serially so they can get the 40% off. Now, what publishers are doing, they're devising minimum packages. They're not actively marketing them. Minimum packages at a much lower price to keep the user subscribed, even at that minimum package. This seems to work, and again, it goes towards retention that is absolutely critical for publishers. However, for me, an even more important point is the registration pivot. Historically, registration for publishers was just an intermediate stage between anonymous to subscriber. So the effort was done to get someone to be from anonymous to be registered and then quickly hit them with subscription offers aggressively. Just a fleeting intermediate stage. It has become increasingly clear that this is not the case. Not every registered user will subscribe. That's a given. They are far more likely to subscribe, actually 25%, 25 times more likely to subscribe than an anonymous browser. However, the majority of them will never subscribe, which means that publishers should seek value in that segment per se. Having a registered user should not be, oh, but we get no revenue. Why? Because potentially, first, one gets more usage. Secondly, one gets more direct visits. Therefore, one gets more inventory. However, the data produced from registered users are of far better quality and far richer than the ones we get through an anonymous user. And this data can be a springboard through audience quality towards essentially a rebooted or revitalized advertising strategy. It is absolutely critical. That's why now publishers increasingly are using an onboarding process for registered users, which is similar to the one they have for subscribers. They realize that registered users are absolutely critical, and they onboard them with the same kind of care and attention that they would do for paid subscribers. In terms of audience, what I found incredibly interesting is the shift of some publishers towards synthetic audiences. It is doable, and actually it gives both to publishers, but also sometimes, like the Times are doing recently, as a service to advertisers, instant feedback for what otherwise might have taken 2 or 3 months. So with synthetic audience, one can test propositions, editorial or commercial, have immediate feedback, and plan accordingly. This, in my view, is expected to grow, and it's a major opportunity for publishers. What is rather challenging, however, is the issue of visibility and discovery with AI overviews, AI mode, and the AI platforms. We used to be SEO masters, and publishers invested a lot in SEO, and now we need to pivot towards generative engine optimization or even answer engine optimization, AEO. Even though several things, if not most, in terms of best practices that I apply for SEO keep being relevant at the geo framework, you need to have authority, you need to have pages that perform well according to core web vitals, etc., etc. The game slightly changes in the sense that you need to mind how you structure your content. to make it answers first, to include more data, to have more video material, and so on. So geo in some ways is SEO plus plus, but this is something that increasingly publishers will need to work hard on. What is very important to note nonetheless is that offline is making a comeback. If we're losing visibility, if discovery is becoming an issue, offline appears to work very, very well. And we're seeing an increasing number of publishers go offline. And actually, not just publishers. For instance, in the US, I think linear TV, not connected TV, linear TV has recorded spectacular advertising growth in Q1 2026. Why? Because it's the AI platforms that are advertising. So all the platforms that are supposed to be digital, that one would expect them to have digital as the channel of choice for their marketing and their communications, they're actually using linear TV. They're using what generally we call offline. Interestingly, historically, and we've seen recent example as well, when a platform messes up or wants to clarify something or make an official statement, what do? They take out a full page ad at the print publication. That doesn't happen every week, but it also shows, nonetheless, that offline is still very, very relevant. Same thing with outdoor. So increasingly, we're seeing a shift back to offline so that the visibility and discovery challenges of the new environments are partly addressed or bypassed. When it comes to product, moving on, I think it's quite clear by now that the app is the graduation product. The app is the channel that gives the higher engagement, the higher possibilities of conversion. Heavy app usage is very much linked to retention. However, the key question is whether, and this is something that is still a critical dilemma for publishers across Europe, and I'm sure in many other markets, is whether one should have one mega app or several smaller ones in parallel or not, especially as advertising monetization in the app environment lags behind. The approach that seems to be working right now is to have indeed one quote unquote mega app, but being able to test the waters with smaller targeted apps. And if they work, they are integrated back into the main app. If one opens the New York Times app, for instance, one will see verticals that have started initially as independent apps. So this seems to be a strategic framework that is possibly emerging. The other thing in terms of product that is all the rage in the last year or so is bundling. Now, you've seen, for instance, since I mentioned the New York Times, there are several European publishers that have added the New York Times in their subscriptions, Le Monde, Politiken, what have you. Bundling does offer a great opportunity. However, again, it must be assessed with a quality versus quantity mindset. In the beginning, publishers threw in things, throw more things than subscriptions without actually testing and analyzing extensively enough. This should change. So, yes to bundling, but only by carefully assessing through audience preferences, through content similarities or complementarities, whether there is value there. I'm saying that because the benefit of having a successful bundle is notable. It increases switching costs, or let's say missing costs. You don't want to cancel because there's so much in that subscription. However, bundling does have quite notable hidden implementation costs. Obviously, these are very low if the bundle is with properties from the same publisher. For instance, El País has a bundle with Cinco Días, the financial newspaper of the same group. This is rather straightforward. But for instance, when Le Monde does a bundle with HBO or Spotify, non-news offerings, their implementation costs can be quite challenging, both in terms of revenue, or actual monetary cost, but even more in terms of human resources and time devoted. Another thing regarding product that I find to be quite intriguing, for years, everybody talks about personalization. I don't need to go through the entire narrative and why personalization is important. It increases retention, performs better, and so on. But for years, we've relied on what we call passive personalization, which means monitoring the user, first-party data, that's fine, and creating, a passive profile, what he or she likes, does not like, what is the navigation path in the site, what are the session duration profile, and so on. However, what we've seen over the last few months is a return of what we call active personalization. Therefore, the user is not only monitored, but actively through a pop-up survey, through an email, gives his express consent on what he wants and he or she wants, or how he or she wants it. For instance, we have a great case study from the biggest news brand in Poland, Gazeta Wyborcza, that pivoted from passive to active. So an amazing difference in terms of result. This sort of data, this sort of profiling, personalization tends to be more accurate, and also it includes trust. It is a far more trustworthy, if you like, way of doing personalization, besides the fact that it is deterministic rather than probabilistic, with all that this entails. Another question that keeps recurring when we're talking about product design and product development is whether we should be deconstructing to help us acquire. It's a corollary of the app point that I mentioned originally. Micro products can be worth it, but again, quality, 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 only if they are done well. Because for every Economist Espresso or Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitungs Der Tag mini apps, there are several where effort was not put to the degree that was necessary, and there's an entire graveyard of such projects in the publishing scene worldwide. So yes, but only if maximum effort and attention is placed. And a final point concerning product, we all grew up, I've been hearing the phrase content is king since the beginning of the World Wide Web in the mid-90s. Content is king. Yes, of course, content is king. However, increasingly, given the importance of UX, design is the crown prince, which means that whereas in the past, people would come up with a product and they would flip it to design, you go and design this now, this didn't work. Increasingly, design is brought in from the very first stage of ideation and development, and is participating in all stages of the product, starting from an idea to prototype, proof of concept, etc. So design is increasingly becoming the crown prince. Moving on to content. You all have noticed, and this is hardly something new, what I call the rush to verticality. News publishers going into verticals. Again, this is something that is incredibly old. Newspapers had vertical or thematic supplements. So this is not something that is as novel as it may appear to be. However, this is becoming increasingly important in terms of brand safe environments that are non-news driven or not dominated by news that are not necessarily that pleasant. However, one must not think that these sort of vertical content areas need to be produced from zero. I've seen plenty of successful case studies. Der Spiegel in Germany is one of them, where the majority of the content, yes, there is new content produced, the majority of the content essentially is existing content that is packaged, brilliantly designed, very well branded into a vertical. So it doesn't have to be 100% produced from start. We've seen that also in things like increasingly now the good news come back. Publishers, to address news avoidance and news fatigue, are turning increasingly to trying to find good news to serve the readers. Libération in France has a great project. So does the Globe and Mail in Canada. In many ways, it's repackaging and designing and branding existing content, and it tends to work well. The shift to audio and video, again, this has been a process that's been going on for a while, but we need to remember the lessons from the past. Those of you that were around about 10 years ago, a bit less, might remember the infamous pivot to video, where several publishers essentially abandoned the old text-based uh, mode of article and photo and went all in on video. It was a disaster. And it cost some properties their existence. So, yes to audio and video, but you should remember how. As things stand, because the decision in the end is an issue of scale and advertising demand, audio is increasingly given challenges in scale, in lower CPMs, in advertiser interest, the fact that one needs to work through usually audio ad networks to have scale. Audio tends to be a paid part of the offering, which means it becomes part of the. There are some free podcasts, needless to say, but more and more it's becoming an element of the paid subscription. Therefore, it is financed from the user. The opposite applies for video. Why? Because the CPMs are much better and demand is there. So audio paid, video free tends to be the rule of thumb for the moment. Liquid media, that's another mega trend that people have been talking about, which means essentially the deconstruction of content into all its separate components, text, photo, audio, video, and even in text, summary or full article, whereby predictably we would serve the ideal combination to every user according to his or her historical preferences, according to the device he or she is accessing from, the time of the day, and so on. Now, this is doable technically. However, it hasn't yet come through in terms of strong consumer demand. Therefore, yes, experiment, but don't fall into what I call the acceptance gap. Something being technologically possible does not necessarily mean that the user is craving for it. And it is in that gap that plenty of endeavors, particularly on the tech side, have fallen through and failed. AI as magic wand. This is increasingly a very important point because publishers, along with the concern and sometimes fear of that huge AI wave coming through, they've also placed quite a lot of hope that AI will be able to solve quite a lot of problems. Well, yes and no. Knowing where and how and when to use AI is becoming more important than the technology itself sometimes one feels. For instance, anything consumer facing, one must handle with immense care. So yes, to internal use of AI, be that ideation or efficiency and faster processes. Yes, do test with low risk, non-critical stages of the production. It will help getting proof of concept. It will help getting buy-in from senior management. However, it is important also to know where and how to use it. For instance, would one use AI when developing health-related content? Perhaps not, or preferably not. So one has to think and assess and judge very carefully where and how to use AI. I should note that for some publishers that went gung-ho and full speed ahead in integrating AI in the consumer-facing part of it, actually lost subscriptions. Why? Because subscriber turned around and said, I'm not paying you for AI. I'm paying you for your journalist and your human judgment. So this needs immense care. Moving on to distribution, we've touched upon on search. However, social remains, especially as search is declining, very important. Less is more and more in less. Even if AI gives us capabilities, addressing every single social media platform with the same care is absolutely impossible. Given finite resources, one needs to prioritize or even abandon some of them and focus on less. Hence, less may be more because we will be putting more effort in less platforms. The key question here is with which selection criteria will one select which platforms, social media platforms, to work with. The parameters are scale, user profile, and monetization opportunities. And frankly, as things stand now, the only platform that ticks all boxes is YouTube. The rest are there to prove their game. But for the moment, according to case studies as well, across Europe, this seems to be the case. Another conundrum is what I refer to as newsfluencers, which means influencers or creators. Let's not go into the definitional difference between creator and influencer. There is one. We can go into that into the Q&A, but let's for a minute use the term interchangeably or as one. Obviously, publishers are quite concerned about the rise of newsfluencers. Why? Because an increasing number of users turn to them rather to the publisher. And here is the dilemma. What do we do? Do we let them be? Do we hire them or have a partnership with them? Do we nurture them? My personal opinion is that hiring, actually working in partnership with creators can be quite risky in terms of the midterm stability of the engagement. So what I've seen as hopeful case studies for the moment is either the hiring of influencers as marketing channels. There have been publishers that have had great success by hiring influencers to market their product and give it the thumbs up, or creating your own influencers from within the team. And not only one of them, you don't be hostage to that, but several. For instance, Les Echos, the largest financial daily in France, has a program called Les Ambassadeurs, the ambassadors, which means that essentially some journalists, mainly through LinkedIn in their case, given that it's a financial newspaper, so LinkedIn works fantastically well for them, become newsfluencers while still being part of Les Echos brand and delivering value. Now, for AI platforms, this is rather a tricky one because we have the visibility and discovery challenges, but we also need to accept that one day, and in the not too distant future, frankly, there will be users whom we will have to meet at ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude because they will not bother to go to the open web. They would want their whole news consumption experience to be through those platforms. This is not something we can ignore. You might say, yes, but we could eventually place an advertisement there. No. In the midterm, one should be able to address and serve that audience where they want to consume the product. And I can say unofficially that I know very well that there are a few publishers right now in Europe that are working on MCP-based offerings, subscription-based offerings to be made available through those platforms. I think we're going to see such a form of distribution of content, paid or free, more and more in the near future. And this might be an interesting game changer. Finally, advertising. Quality and transparency. You may be aware of the famous gold standard programs that numerous national IABs in Europe have created, the UK, Sweden, Ireland, for instance, that revolve around brand safety, ad fraud, creative standards, clutter, very important in terms of UX, because there's UX and there's AdX in terms of advertising experience, something that historically we have not, as publishers, paid too much attention to, and that has been a mistake we've paid dearly. Privacy. Why? Because privacy is a cornerstone of trust. These are necessary. However, admittedly, it's been a frustrating experience because publishers that have implemented the gold standard have actually not seen rivers of revenue coming their way. Actually, they haven't taken money from the platforms, but from other publishers that have not implemented that. But it's table stakes. It must be done. The other thing to address is the need for scale. Publisher alliances is a chronic headache and existential challenge, dare I say, of our industry. We've never been able to get this fully right, but this will become increasingly important. Single sign-ons have not worked particularly well, but watch this space. There's a great experiment taking place now in Denmark with ad IDs, with common ad IDs, and I expect towards the end of 2026 that there will be something very interesting to share and possibly a prototype for people, if not to copy, certainly to get inspired by. More services. One would like to think that one could have more services in terms of events, of brand and content, in terms of even performance services to advertising clients. However, and that this would lead immediately to more revenue and more share. Yes and no. Again, impact to effort, very important, but also bear in mind when you assess these sort of projects that there's a retention dimension here. So even if you offer a new service and you don't see an explosion of revenue, just a marginal increase or a commitment to continue spending with you, in the very near term, that retention dimension, that engagement with key advertising clients has value in itself. What we need to discuss, and this is something that we must get serious about over the next few months, is redefining context, and especially brand safety. Brand safety, as I was mentioning earlier, is something that has been applied in a manner that made us pay dearly. Now, with AI, this is one of the benign cases of AI, this may change because you don't have to rely on keywords, on blunt keywords anymore. You can rely on AI understanding the semantics and the real context of the article, and also helping the quest for intent signals that over the next 12 to 18 months are going to be all the rage. A final point. We've heard the rhetoric about attention, and this is an area where publishers certainly have a concrete competitive advantage if you look at session times, time spent on page, and so on. This should be a competitive advantage for us. However, before one moves full speed ahead with this, bear in mind again the words versus deeds gap from the buy side. Everybody says they want it, but are they willing to pay for it? And are they going to implement it? So this is where one needs to be especially careful. So, in lieu of a synopsis, 5 key points in terms of major takeaways. Stating the obvious, trust the foundation of quality. Quality, as defined in my previous slides or as outlined in my previous slides, is the foundation for sustainable growth, reasonable growth, achievable growth, contestable growth. Registered users, in my view, will be the make or break for publishers in the near future. It's going to make all the difference, not only because subscriptions are plateauing, but because the advertising opportunity through the data they produce, if planned and executed well, can be a game changer. As I was saying earlier, know where to deploy AI and where absolutely not. This needs human judgment and a great emphasis to being placed before decisions are made. The impact to effort ratio, again, one needs to optimize this as much as possible in terms of being able to measure, predict and measure impact. And prediction is critical here because if one gets it totally wrong, then the equation is totally wrong. And the same thing applies for the effort required. One needs to plan, for instance, for project overruns and so on. So having an optimized and well-functioning impact to effort ratio can make all the difference. And as I was saying earlier, as a final comment, brand building to be able to stand out in this ocean of content, be it the AI slop, the MFAs, whatever, brand building has never been more important. And this is something that we have to seriously bear in mind. And with that, I will thank you for your attention and open it to any comments or questions.
Many thanks, Konstantin. I think that certainly gives publishers and the wider ecosystem a number of actionable steps that they can take to actually, like we said in the beginning, not only survive but to thrive in this world that we find ourselves in. So thank you very much for that.